Hello, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 18, Section 2, Challenging Segregation. So, number one, where did four college students begin their sit in movement in 1960? That began at a Woolworths, which is what used to be known as a five and dime kind of store, lunch counter in the city of Greensboro, North Carolina. These students, for the most part, that you see photographed below here, really started a movement that's going to extend throughout the Deep South. They went in, sat at the counter, but were refused service because the counters were reserved for only white clientele. Throughout the South, this was pretty common. And so many Woolworths in places like Nashville, in Montgomery, and so forth would have students go in, sit down at the counters, and sit there until either they are physically removed by protesters or people who are in the crowd, or when law enforcement would come in and break up the demonstration. Number two, who organized a convention at Shaw University and urged students to establish what is known as SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and that was a woman named Ella Parker. Ella um, understood that the SCLC, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which had members like Martin Luther King Jr., for example, was a great organization, but we needed something more for the young people. And she encouraged these young people to organize their own group and to become somewhat independent. And hence we have the birth of SNCC. Uh, which SNCC volunteer from New York began the voter education project that helped rural African Americans register to vote, and that was a man named Robert Moses. Eventually, his volunteers are going to be going into places in Mississippi, trying to register voters, receiving lots and lots of threats from white supremacists and such, but certainly getting more people out there utilizing their rights to vote. Number four, who helped organize the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and challenged the legality of segregated Democratic parties at the 1964 Democratic National Convention, and that was a woman named Fannie Lou Hamer. Number five, what were teams of African Americans and whites who traveled the South in 1961 known as? They were known as Freedom Riders. Many of our freedom riders were individuals who had been part of SNCC. They purposely got on these buses and they headed south, hoping to end the practice of interstate segregated bus systems. Photographed below here is one of our freedom riders named John Lewis. John Lewis is a member of Congress today and was one of the founding members of SNCC and was also a freedom rider. Number six, what was the purpose of the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity, or the CEEO? And that was to stop federal discrimination against African Americans in hiring and promoting of people. Number seven, although unwilling to challenge the Southern Democrats in Congress, what did President Kennedy do to support the civil rights movement? He basically allowed for the Justice Department to file lawsuits to help African Americans register to vote. When we talk about our Southern Democrats, you kind of have to kind of talk about who was involved. And one of the men who was involved in this movement was a guy named Strom Thurmond. We're going to talk more about Strom Thurmond, but uh, for the most part, he was one of the longest, had one of the longest tenures in our Congress. He passed away a number of years ago, but he was still a member of Congress well beyond his 100th birthday. Needless to say, the Justice Department under Kennedy was headed up by Robert Kennedy, that would be John F. Kennedy's younger brother. And really, Robert Kennedy was probably out of the two Kennedys, he was probably more apt to be concerned about the rights of African Americans. Number 8. What federal agency did President Kennedy order to tighten its regulations against segregated bus terminals? And that was the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission. Number 9, who tried to register at the University of Mississippi but was turned back by the governor of the state? And that was a man named James Meredith. James Meredith had served in the United States Air Force uh, as part of his compensation package with the GI Bill. He wanted to register for classes at the University of Mississippi, which at that time was an all white institution. Eventually, he's given the opportunity to attend classes, but what's sad is that many of the classrooms were set up segregated seating for him. Not only are you going to see men like James Meredith challenging these practices at black or at major universities in the South, you're going to see it at the University of Alabama, probably most famous for the event with Governor George Wallace standing at the in front of the doors of the admissions building, chanting segregation now, segregation, uh, and so forth tomorrow, trying to prevent students from enrolling in his school. Number 10, what was Dr. King's reason for launching demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama in the spring of 1963? And part of that was to provoke a violence response against demonstrators, which would get President Kennedy to actively support the civil rights um, legislation. The sad thing is Birmingham, Alabama, was a city of lots and lots of violence, and certainly the bombing incident of one of the churches was probably very famously documented. But just the way the police handled African American demonstrators was really really extreme. Number 11. What was the reason for the August 28th, 1963 March on Washington? And this goes back to building a public support for pushing civil rights bills through Congress. The actual first March on Washington had been planned way back in the time of the Second World War by a group of young men at that time. By the time we get to the 1960s, organizations like the Southern Leadership Conference and SNCC definitely get involved in trying to make sure that members of Congress and even voters back home were aware of what was going on as far as the legislation before Congress. Number 12, what two events delayed the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? And part of that was the fact that the Senate had a filibuster. A filibuster is an event where people get up and they talk as long as they possibly can to delay the voting on a bill. And a lot of these filibustering senators were senators from the Deep South, and with the hope of maybe not voting on this until maybe a later date. The other event was the assassination of President Kennedy. After Kennedy's death, Lyndon B. Johnson makes it a priority to get the civil rights legislation signed. And eventually it does happen in 1964. And we do see a Voting Rights Act piece of legislation passed in 1965. So, what were the key elements of the Civil Rights Act of 64? Part of that was it made segregation illegal. It gave citizens equal access to facilities, gave the Attorney General more power to enforce school disc- um, discrimination issues, established the Equal Employment Commission. And number 14, what became the focus of the Civil Rights Movement passage after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 65. And part of that was to help African Americans achieve full social and economic equality. Stay tuned.